Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yvonne Valancourt, and I'm the director of the Nantucket Field Station. We are an entity of Umass Boston, and we're managed by the School for the Environment. We sit on conservation land owned by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. We run classes, and we also support a wide range of researchers, both from the Umass system, but also from other universities, institutions, and agencies. We teach classes that are accredited, and you don't have to be a UMass student to take them. And we have a wide range of programs of research that are ongoing. At the moment, though, we are remote because of the COVID situation. It is my distinct pleasure this evening to introduce a fellow alum from UMass Boston. John C. Warner started off at UMass Boston, and he is a rock star in his field. And I mean that not only because he is a co-founder of the field of green chemistry, but he also started at UMass Boston as a music student, but went on and ended up with a degree in chemistry. He did quite well, and he ended up at Princeton University getting his PhD. He then went on to Polaroid, where he worked for a decade, I believe it was, before ending up as a professor back at UMass Boston, where he started the first PhD program globally in green chemistry. He then went on to UMass Lowell, where he established the Center for Green Chemistry and was the director there. After which, he and Jim Babcock created the Warner Babcock Institute of Green Chemistry, and he and his wife, Amy Cannon, started the Beyond Benign educational program of green chemistry. It's a nonprofit foundation. I could go on and on about John. He is a rock star. He has numerous prestigious awards, presidential, vice presidential, industry. Like I said, I could go on. But I would rather listen to him and have you listen to him as well. He is indeed the co-founder of the field of green chemistry, and it is my distinct pleasure right now to introduce you to John C. Warner.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here speaking to my alma mater, and just wish that this was a real live session and I could see people in their eyes than the simulated forum that we all have. I'm sure we're all getting a little over this, but it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to, with the magic of technology, transform the image that you see from my face to slides. If everything goes well, we will successfully transition this way. So if everything is going good, you now see my slides here. Today, what I want to talk about is I want to kind of address the polarization that we have in society. Heaven knows the politics in the United States are intensely polarized. We've just become a culture of camps or tribes, and we believe in this thing or that thing, and we identify with these things. And it's a very scary situation that we find ourselves in, especially when it comes to things like sustainability and the future of the human species. I want to look at it from, and the thing is that from my perspective, the way that I look at this is that we have very serious issues that are facing us, but we can't go down the road of despair. We can't construct our entire view by how everything is bad. Look to the left, look to the right, both of you are going to die of cancer, everything is bad. It is a scary situation that we find ourselves in, but people are not motivated to action by negativity. Okay, can you imagine if Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "I have a nightmare"? I think that people might have written checks, but they wouldn't have got up and done stuff. And if we're really going to have a positive impact, we've got to recognize that there's positivity here. There are options and there are opportunities. And that's what, gets me waking up every day and doing the things that I do, because of this profound optimism that we can figure this out. The chemical enterprises has a lot of amazing things to be proud of. Look at the ag industry and the agricultural industry. Since 1990, global food production has increased 82% worldwide. 82% increase. Think of the undernourished people in developing countries that now have food, the way that we've distributed and created all these mechanisms to improve output of food to feed the hungry. The people, the women and the men wearing lab coats, working in chemistry labs, inventing these technologies. It should come as no surprise that 80% increase in global food production comes with a corollary 80% increase in chemical additives and fertilizers and pesticides to support this kind of. So at one level, we can look at this and say, wow, isn't this so cool? Chemistry is feeding the hungry. But of course, if you open up the newspaper, turn on the radio, look on the internet, what do you see? Pesticide residues in food, toxicity, hazards. Isn't it interesting that we have the good and we have the bad? When we think of the electronics industry historically since 1970 has had a linear increase by obeying Moore's laws of how many computations per unit area of an integrated circuit chip can be developed of, and we have methodically just gotten better and better. My cell phone now, this little cell phone, has orders of magnitude more computational power than the entire Apollo space mission. All right, because of the advent of all this stuff. When you think of the amazing things, the health, the computers in hospitals, the computers in our cars, how everything is just so now transformed in our society in a positive way because of these abilities to do these computations. But of course, you open up the newspaper, you turn on the radio, you look on the internet, and you hear about electronic wastes, endangered elements. We have the good and we have the bad. When it comes to the energy sector, photovoltaics, solar energy, since 1975, the increase in efficiency, the reduction in cost, the availability in more strenuous conditions, been amazing R&D, amazing contributions of the women and men working in labs, pouring beakers and flasks and inventing stuff. Wind energy, tidal energy, even there's some advances in petroleum industries that the availability now of more in energy has transformed, again, uplifting people out of poverty because of the availability of energy. So there's a lot to be proud of. But of course, you open up the newspaper, turn on the radio, look on the internet, and rightly so, we hear about global climate change, and we hear about the Greenland ice sheets melting and the fires in California. Again, we have the good and we have the bad. In the pharmaceutical industry, check this out, since 1975, if you get diagnosed with cancer, since 1975, the survivability for 10 years has increased more than 50% because of the advent of new medicines and new pharmaceuticals and technologies. Even the 1-year survivability has amazingly progressed from doing this. These are inventions in chemistry labs with women and men pouring beakers and flasks. We should be pretty happy, but you open up the newspaper, turn on the radio, look on the internet, and we hear about pharmaceuticals and the environment, toxicity, and hazard. There is the good and there is the bad. And finally, when we look at the materials system, look at this. In 1989, the global production of plastics by volume surpassed the global production of steel by volume and never turned around. It's kind of amazing when you think about it, that plastics, the advent of lightweight, inexpensive materials has transformed our society. People in developing countries now have shelter over them to protect themselves from the climate, clothing to protect themselves from the weather. They have materials that protect their food supply to allow them to be stored and shipped. There's amazing advances from the invention of these lightweight, inexpensive materials. But of course, you open up the newspaper, turn on the radio, look on the internet, and we hear about ocean plastics and toxicity and hazards. We've got the good and we've got the bad. It's kind of interesting that in the society, in the service to society, the chemical enterprises has this duality. And we can get all worked up about the good, the bad, and things. But wait a minute, we scientists, especially we chemists, are kind of used to these superimposable dualities, right? Since 1906, we've said that matter is both a particle and a wave. Well, how can it be both a particle and a wave? This duality is kind of interesting. So if we can balance that for over 100 years, the fact that technologies have a positive impact, but also have a negative impact, that duality shouldn't be that challenging. The point here is, what do we do about it? And so now we are in 2020, and I am so moved by Mahatma Gandhi's quote, "The difference between what we do and what we are capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems." That's pointing to the optimism of that we can do this, that it's not away from our means and ability, but we just got to figure out how to put the pieces together. And we have plenty of guides, okay? Look at this, we have Cradle to Cradle, the Resilience Institute, we have natural capitalism, the circular economy, responsible care, limits to growth, biomimicry, UN SDGs, the European Green Deal, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, green chemistry. There's all these different approaches. Now, of course, the way that I look at this is represents a massive diversity that is kind of representative of the human species. And that what we need to see is that every single one of these approaches are beautiful and have merit and have a way of looking for a positive future. Again, we're in a polarized society where we're those members of our society that want to say, oh, well, this approach is wrong and this approach is right. Oh, get over it. Are you serious? If someone is motivated and moved intellectually and emotionally by one of these things, oh my God, then that's the best thing that they should be doing. And we need to have the humility and recognize all of this has a contribution. But it's a lot of stuff. How do we put it all together? How do we, one individual looking at all of this, we need some way of looking at it. So I want to do a disclaimer before I click the next button on my computer here. And I want to say, I don't claim to have any gifted insight. I don't claim to have some deep answers to questions, okay? I have lived my life. I'm 58 years old. I've been a professional chemist for 36 years. I've come to see the world through a certain lens, and I see it a certain way. With a great deal of humility and vulnerability, I will share with you the way I see the world. But don't for a second have the belief that I have this presumption that I'm telling you what you should think or believe. We got plenty of people that want to do that. My role is to share with you what I have to say. And if what I have to say makes sense to you and you like it, that's wonderful. If what I have to say to you is not something that you're interested in, well, that's okay too. And so please understand, if I ever come off sounding like I'm pompously saying that this is the way the world is, understand, no. This is the way I see it. And I, more than anyone else, recognize immediately the potential for me not having it quite right. But it works for me. All right. And so the way that I look at it is we take natural resources, and through the process of extraction, we make molecules and ingredients. Now we take these molecules and ingredients, and through the process of synthesis, we make materials and components. Then we take these materials and components, and through manufacturing, we make the products that populate our world. Now, if we do a good job with these products, they stay in use and reuse as long as possible. But inevitably, something's going to go wrong. And when that happens, we have to go counterclockwise on my pendulum here. And we have to create, with mechanical recycling, go back to materials components, then manufacture products, mechanically recycle in the recycle system. But inevitably, we have to go counterclockwise to the next system through molecular processing, go back to the ingredients in what I call materials metabolism. And then again, the next system is through degradation. We take molecules and degrade them into natural resources through regeneration. And of course, we want to keep those natural resources in a stable ecosystem. This is not a circle, it's a pendulum that goes clockwise and counterclockwise. The human-built world is clockwise, and the natural world is counterclockwise. And the point here is my operational definition of sustainability is to look at that intersection on the bottom. And what we want is to attempt, it's not achievable. Zero impact is not achievable. We will have some impact, but to minimize as much as possible the impact of the human-built world on the natural ecosystems. And if we can be ever vigilant to minimize that as much as possible, that, from my perspective, is a definition of sustainability that's actually somewhat quantifiable. Let's look at this, though. This isn't something that is just a human-built world. Every one of these cycles, in my opinion, has a natural counterpart. If we look at the use and reuse system, a hermit crab. When a hermit crab gets bigger, it leaves one shell and it goes to another shell. It didn't make that shell, it found it. It's a durable good that is used and reused and reused and reused. And so in human-built world, it's kind of like a car bumper or a playground. We want these things to stay in use. People will use it in different ways, but it stays in use over and over again. Or we have like a cup that we hope we can reuse over and over and over again. The hallmark of this is what we're trying to do is maintain the chemical composition and maintain the shape and form. So this use and reuse system is defined by when you're not changing the chemistry and you're not changing the form. And wouldn't it be cool if this lasted forever? But it doesn't. Things happen, stuff breaks. And when things break, what we've got to do is we go down the entropy cycle to counterclockwise the next station, and the next station is the recycle station. In nature, a bird will go and get a twig and build a nest. A beaver will cut down a tree and make a dam. We humans will collect, sort, shred, melt, and granulate plastics so that we can mechanically recycle plastics. Now, what we're doing in this case is we're maintaining the composition. The chemistry is untouched, but the shape is being changed. We're taking the plastic balls, we're grinding them up, and we're making little pellets and back and forth. So the ideal here is to maintain the composition, but keep changing the form. But of course, every time we do mechanical recycling, if it's paper, or we're going to break the fibers, or if it's plastic, we're going to break the polymers, and inevitably, that's weird, inevitably we're going to break the size of the particles to a point where it no longer functions well. At which point we have to go counterclockwise on our pendulum, and entropy comes in, and we go to the materials metabolism cycle. This is the one that very few people talk about, but the one that I'm most excited about, where I think we need to pay the most attention. In this case here in nature, we know that we take large molecules like a carbohydrate, a protein, or a lipid, and we break them into small molecules like a sugar, an amino acid, or a fatty acid through the process of metabolism. And then we take those small molecules and we make big molecules. Here's a picture of my wife and daughter. It's an old picture. Natalie is now 8 years old, but in this picture they're eating. What happens when we eat food? We digest the food and it breaks up, but that's not all. What happens when we eat food is we don't only destroy the molecules and convert them to smaller parts. At exactly the same time that we're eating, we're growing hair, we're growing fingernails, we're growing blood cells. Nature does at the same time the deconstruction and the construction of materials. That's the opportunity. And the reason nature does that is because nature couples energy. Not only are we doing the making of the stuff, but we're making energy and we're using energy at the same time in biology. And we do this through the magic of the molecule ATP. These three phosphate groups have that negative charge in those oxygens that have all this electrostatic repulsion, very high potential energy. It's like a little molecular battery. And nature does some chemistry reactions that give off energy. So we ram some phosphate groups together and we charge our battery. And sometimes when we need that energy, we break those phosphate groups and we use those energies. So nature has evolved to couple the molecular transformations with the energetics. Okay, and then the hallmark of this is really cool because now we're changing both the chemical composition and the form. So we have the most degrees of freedom. Now, of course, this can't last forever, and we have to go counterclockwise on our entropy circle here, and we go to the regeneration cycle. In nature, we've got termite mounds, dung beetles, bees pollinating, lions eating prey. In the human-built world, we have biodegradable packaging. The food supply is, for the most part, resilient, but we still got ways to go. Textiles that are biodegradable, and now there's even some products that are biodegradable. This is defined by altering the composition, but conserving the form. It's a little bit more complicated, and if I had time, I'd go into it, but I'm going to have to move on to go onto this thing. But then the final system, of course, is the stable ecosystems, and this needs no description. I think we all intuitively, through biophilia, kind of understand and appreciate what this means. So when we look at this entire system, the thing, I'm a full member of the Club of Rome. We're the ones that started the concept of systems thinking decades ago. And systems thinking is mapping out as much as you can on any kind of dynamic system. The caution about systems thinking is you must have a great deal of humility because no one is smart enough to get these maps perfectly right. And more importantly, oftentimes it's not the things you put on the map that cause trouble, the things you forget to put on the map. And when we define a system like this nice, pretty pendulum going back and forth, it's imperfect because of this thing called leakage. When we recycle, some things get out of the system and they get into our intersection and make a little bit of porosity between those two systems, and sustainability loses a little bit. When we do materials metabolism, there's leakage into the environment. We open up bigger hole between that interface, and sustainability suffers again. When we do regeneration, there's leakage in the environment. The porosity opens up more and sustainability gets smaller. And so it's not only the things on the map, but it's the leakage that causes the trouble. And so when someone makes one of these beautiful maps of supply chains and flows and stuff like that, you very rarely see them put something like this on the map. You don't see them put this on the map. You don't see them put this on the map. You don't see them put this on the map. And all the problems that are facing society, for the most part, aren't the things that are on the map. It's the things that are falling off the map. What do we do about this leakage? Now, there's two approaches. If you go clockwise in this diagram, it's about human behavior. It's about motivating groups of people to just figure this out, reduce consumption, recycle, do things. But we have a moral and ethical responsibility to invent technologies to facilitate these behavioral modifications. But at the same time, on the counterclockwise direction, we have technology. We can go in the lab and invent technologies that are more compatible with nature. One isn't more important than the other. The whole point here is they both have to happen. It's not just chemists are going to save the world here. Everyone has a role to play. Chemists have an important role, but everyone else has a role too. All right. And again, like I said before, the materials metabolism system, because we have the most degrees of freedom, that's where we have the most opportunity for innovation and creativity. All right. And that is the domain of green chemistry. As you know, some people know that are hearing that back in the early 90s, Paul Anastas, also a graduate of UMass Boston, and I started the field of green chemistry when we wrote this book called Green Chemistry Theory and Practice. Got to tell you, had I thought anyone was ever going to read this book, we would have written a better book. It's kind of, I feel like Forrest Gump, that, you know, just all of a sudden the world just says, oh my God, this is amazing. But if you open the book and you turn the pages, you say, okay, well, this is kind of obvious, or this is kind of obvious. You know, this is kind of obvious. It's just, gee whiz, chemists should anticipate the potential for negative harm, you know, before they invent something. Kind of a no-brainer. But it must have been the right time at the right place. But next thing you know, it's been translated in over 15 languages. At last count, I've been to over 65 countries in the world, meeting presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens. And really, what's really important here is the 12 principles. And remember, from my perspective, anyone could have written this book. There's nothing amazing here. It's just, gee, before you make something, you should anticipate the negative impacts. The 12 principles are kind of like a guideline that says we got to address this before we invent the technology. Because if we wait till after we invent the technology, it's already on store shelf, it's too late. Now we got to pick up the mess. So we need to change the way we invent. And my whole position, and this isn't to talk on specifically green chemistry, but if anyone's ever heard me talk, my whole point is if you look at the curriculum of every university on the planet, very few chemistry programs offer, let alone require, students to learn how to predict whether something might be toxic or not. They often never learn how to predict whether something might have some impact on human health and the environment. And so how can we invent better technologies if it's not self-definitional to the field of chemistry, that it should be maybe the first class that you take as you're learning chemistry? You know, we have in chemistry, there's analytical, there's physical, there's organic. There should be a body of knowledge that is called green chemistry. And that's what Paul Anastas and we said we need to do this. And so now here it is, fast forward almost 20 years, and there are, oh my God, there's 12 journals dedicated to green chemistry. At last count, there's over 50 textbooks for green chemistry. Every major multinational company has green chemistry programs. Every government has green chemistry programs and things like that. Universities still haven't really caught up. Only universities haven't caught up. Every other aspect of society has made leaps and bounds of advances in green chemistry. But this isn't an aversion to green. It's not an aversion to environmentalism. Sadly, you know, being a professor at a university is a damn hard job. You got to teach, you got to do research, you got to do service. It's really a nerve-wracking. So it's really hard to get new stuff in the curriculum. So if you look at the chemistry textbook that I had in the early 80s, and you look at the chemistry textbook of 2020, you will be hard-pressed to see much of a difference. Now, the field of chemistry has evolved quite a bit, but we're still teaching it exactly the way we taught it 40 years ago. This isn't some epic battle of good and evil. There's all kinds of reasons for it, but it's important to understand that not having green chemistry in the curriculum at university isn't a rejection of green. It's acknowledgement that it's just really hard to change anything in how we teach chemistry. Okay, and so my point though is that green chemistry is not thinking about making better products. It's not talking about making better products. It is the act of removing hazard from society. So yes, the technology has to be more environmentally benign than some incumbent technology, but that's not enough. It has to work better than the technology we're trying to replace. No one is going to buy something that doesn't work, and it has to have the right cost. If it's too expensive, then not everyone can get it. So the definition of green chemistry requires the technology to work better, cost better, and oh, by the way, it's better for human health and the environment. And that point is really important because who wouldn't want it? Right? You think about it, better performance, better cost, you know, and oh, by the way, it's better for the environment. There's no pushback from this stuff here. The issue though, of course, is if you accept that definition, then the only roadblock must be we don't have the inventions yet. And that's it. So how do we rethink chemistry? How do we rethink how we make stuff so that we can start addressing this, inventing better technologies? So the way I look at it, okay, the circular economy, I am an advisor of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm author on many of their reports with a lot of other authors. The circular economy defines a closed loop: natural resources, manufacturing, distribution, use, collection. It's a closed loop. Here's the thing, a closed loop. Not only does it keep things in, but how does an invention enter into a closed loop? So it presupposes we've got all the solutions. And I would argue that we don't have nearly enough. Maybe we have 20, 30% of the solutions. We still need 60, 70% of inventions. And if we're talking about closed loops, where do those inventions get in? So in my head, being twisted the way I am, I put a twist on this and I make this a Mobius strip that has two cycles to it. And then I superimpose what I call the materials ecology, this flow of materials, and I superimpose on it the intellectual ecology, basic research, applied research, development, scale up, commercialization. For us to get this to happen, these two processes have to be hand in hand and in sync with each other. So we have universities inventing stuff and publishing papers. We have companies making products and sending them into the outside world. And right now, those two are not close enough together. We've really got to recognize that part of the role of the university is to invent the solutions that are going to help society, not just publish papers. And so somehow these things have to come together. And I think this model helps because essentially, put it this way, imagine that we wanted to build a pond. A group of us said, hey, let's make a pond. We'd go find a field, we'd dig a hole, we'd fill it with water, we'd put in some fish, we'd put in a frog and some trees. Now, if we spent a great deal of time and effort measuring the pH, measuring the chemistry, adding this, skimming this, we could keep this going forever. But if we went on vacation for a couple months, probably we'd come back and everything would be dead because we're not smart enough to construct stable ecosystems. We don't have the knowledge yet to make this work. You know, a real pond, here's another picture of my wife and daughter near where we live up here in Wilmington. And this is a pond. This pond works. The birds, the bees, the bunnies, the bugs, the beavers, the beetles, they all have this dynamic equilibrium that has evolved over the millennia. And so that the dynamic equilibrium of materials and energy work through the time-tested process of trial and error over hundreds of thousands of years. Now that's confusing. That's a lot of stuff. How are we going to understand that? Well, you know, we can start scratching at the surface, right? We know stuff. So here is a diagram of the metabolism of a cell. It's a super complicated diagram, and it's kind of cool that we humans actually figured this out and know this. Now, of course, I would argue this is just the tip of the iceberg. This represents probably a single-digit percentage of what we ultimately need to learn and know, but it's a start. This is pretty cool. And so how do we use this to start getting to the circularity, the sustainability? Problem is, of course, here is a factory in Europe, here's a factory in Asia, here's a factory in North America, here's a factory in South America. We've got the electronics industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the cosmetics industry, the textile industry, and we're trying to find a way to make the output of this be an input of this and make all of this work like my pond with the birds and the bees and the bunnies and the bugs. But the problem is that these things evolved 40, 50 years ago, completely in isolation, unaware of each other. So they weren't designed to share resources. They weren't designed in a cohabitative ecosystem. And so here we are now trying to find a way to push it together, and it isn't easy. But it's also not impossible. Because if you look at this really, really close, and you look even closer, and you look even closer, there's one thing that everything on this slide has in common. Chemistry, biology, and us. There is hope if we figure out how to learn from nature, take the humility and approach nature and its infinite wisdom and figure out how can we make these cycles that apply to the human built world. We can do this, but we need to rethink how we approach this. All right. And so I feel that we humans have a way too much of an egotistical approach to this. Listen to our language. We break bonds, we make bonds. Oh, aren't we cool? We're very forceful in how we do chemistry. All right. It's almost as if when we manufacture a product, if you listen really close, the product as it comes off of the assembly line, you can hear it scream, no, because we're forcing the molecule under high temperature, high pressure, with all these harsh reagents to do things it just doesn't want to do. And so if, in my opinion, we need to learn from Lynn Margulis, the amazing biologist. She passed away a few, her book, The Symbiotic Planet. She says that evolutionary forces are not necessarily driven by survival of the fittest, this very Darwinian approach, but it's really driven by survival of the most compatible. And that kind of takes the ego out. And so in my silly way of talking, what I say is that we need to be molecular psychologists. We need to sit down, put a molecule on the couch and say, what do you want to be? And when the molecule looks up at us with these big electronic eyes and says, I want to be a paint. Well, you know what? That's going to be a heck of a paint. It's not going to fade. It's not going to chip because it wants to stay on the wall and it wants to be a paint. Now, what I really mean here is we got to look at the molecular topography, look at the electron density, look at how the hydrophilic groups and hydrogen bonding and everything. We need to, though, instead of forcing it to do what we want it to do, we've got to figure out what the inherent tendencies are and design our products to be consistent with that. Now, if we're going to start doing this, we need to learn from nature and see different things. So I have come up with my observations of my 5 nature's mechanisms. So I'll share them with you. The first one is triggered change. So ever think about this? When we eat food and we digest food, there's a lot of food that kind of looks like us, right? A hamburger, a steak, a piece of chicken. There's not a lot of difference between that and our stomach. Well, how does our stomach know to eat the food but not to eat us? Why don't we eat ourselves with our digestive stuff? Why don't we erode everything? Well, it's because nature has evolved triggering mechanisms. A zymogen called pepsinogen is released into our stomach, and as the HCl is released, it snips out a piece of that enzyme and it creates the active form, pepsin, and then it does its work. And then when it's done with its work, it gets turned off. So turn on, turn off. Another example. I'm very quiet and I come and I go, ah, and I scare you. When you get scared, you go into a fight or flight mode. And what happens is the neurons in your body, you have a neuron, a neurojunction, a receiving neuron with a bunch of receptors. As the impulse comes down one nerve, it pushes neurotransmitters through your junction, they bind, and then it propagates that signal. Now think about this. If we continued to be scared, we ran around for the rest of our life, running around with our hands up over our head because we were scared, that's kind of a bad situation. So how nature has evolved is we have an enzyme in the neurojunction called acetylcholinesterase, which snips the acetyl into 2 pieces, deactivating it. And as it deactivates, it shuts down that signal. Nature triggers things. So we think of a radio turning up the volume. It's very rare do you see things like that in nature. Most things are step functions. We don't say that ice is 20% melted at one temperature, 50% melted. No, it's a solid, it's a solid. We hit the melting point, boom, it becomes a liquid. Okay, it is a triggered change. Okay, and so we can understand if we design our products understanding these triggers. We're talking about shelf life stability, product performance, and product stability. When we think of sustainability, we want to have a milk carton that's going to vanish into the environment. But do we want it to just linearly biodegrade? Well, I'm telling you, if I open up my refrigerator and the milk carton decided to biodegrade while it was still in my refrigerator, I'm going to be pretty unhappy. So I don't really want a linear degradation. I want to put a trigger in our cells, in nature. There is so many ways that we could transform materials to undergo some kind of an environmental trigger. We just need to ask nature, and she will tell us. All right, so my example, just to show that this isn't just weirdness, I actually invented a technology. Asphalt in the United States, there's 1 billion miles of asphalt pavement. Every year, the sun and the air oxidize the surface of the asphalt, making it brittle and hard. So 10% gets repaved every year. This hard asphalt, maybe we can take 5%, grind it up, and use it in a new road. But 95%, 90% of it has to go to a landfill. I said, why? Why can't we use all of it? So I invented an additive that goes in and looks at how the sunlight triggers the damage, and I reversed that trigger. And so now we can take 100% of yesterday's dug up asphalt, put in my additive, and tomorrow, instead of buying new asphalt, we can repave the road with a brand new, with the old stuff. So here we got a circular economy. The processing temperature is lowered. It's non-toxic. It's actually edible. I don't recommend you eat it. And it's also self-healing. And so the company's name is Collaborative Aggregates. And for the last several years, Delta S and Delta Mist, the two things that we got 4 regional sales offices. And so going from an idea in my head, doing tests and starting the company took about 14 months. Tell me that's slow. And it was because I learned from nature about these triggering chemistries, and I used the 12 principles of chemistry, of green chemistry, to accelerate. The next example is collaborations. A lot of organizations will send its people out to have some kind of skills assessment. We take this test, answer a bunch of questions, and I'm good at math, I'm good at communication. A bad organization will tell its people, we want everyone to be excellent at everything. And so the poor math person has to go and take a public speaking class. And the poor good communicator has to go take a math class. And so everyone is miserable. Everybody's sad because they're being forced to do stuff they don't want to do. The reason someone's good at math is because they probably love math. And so a smart organization says, whatever people love doing, let's have them do more of it. Let's have them become amazingly good at it because that's what they love to do. And through management, let's create collaborations where everyone's working together and everyone's happy. Well, what I realized a long time ago, we never figured this out in chemistry. In chemistry, we make these island of Dr. Moreau molecules where we take all this complicated stuff. We have one functional group is to do one thing. This functional group has another property. This does something, this does something. So all this stuff is rammed into one molecule, but all we really want is a simple molecule. Think of all the cost and the synthesis, the waste, and all the stuff that has to go on to this process. My point is when we do stuff like this, look at this. I want to take this hydroquinone and I want to make it less water soluble. I'll do the methyl ethyl propyl butyl futyl. I'll do try to find some way of making this work. But what happens when I put that methyl group on? What I'm actually doing is the covalent chemistry is not that relevant. What I'm actually doing is mitigating the intermolecular forces between the molecule and the surroundings. If I make the intermolecular forces between the molecules stronger, it'll be less water soluble. If I make them weaker, it'll be more water soluble. And so this is the approach. And this approach of methyl ethyl propyl butyl futyl doesn't happen in nature. Nature uses collaborations. We have proteins, we have phospholipid bilayers, we have carbohydrates. Nature creates this amazing self-assembled aggregate in which each molecule has them, but they're not covalently stuck together. They're hanging together because molecular psychology, they want to hang together. And that's an entirely different mindset that we humans don't actually do all that much. Okay, but if we did, if we said, okay, let's put other molecules in the system so that they collaborate with each other instead of making all these derivatives, this is what I call non-covalent derivatization. Okay, and I'm such a nerd. The license plate of my car is NCD for non-covalent with, so I really get into this. Okay, and so I got the Perkin medal, which is the highest award in chemistry in the United States. The only award you get higher than that is the Nobel Prize. So it's pretty cool. People think I got it for green chemistry, but I actually got it for non-covalent derivatization, and which is what got me into green chemistry, so it's not unrelated. But this is my approach to this. And so, for example, tree bark is a collaboration of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, right? And so my example in the real world, my investor and I, we spun out a company called Collaborative Medicinal Development. It's a pharmaceutical company. I found this molecule that is really insoluble, but if you take it with DMSO and surfactants and stuff, you can see in laboratory animals some really good cognition results and some neurobiological results. But you could never use this on a human because you can't take DMSO and a bunch of surfactants. So I took and I made an NCD with a binary system, and I customized how it crossed the blood-brain barrier and increased the oral bioavailability. Well, next thing you know, the Michael J. Fox Foundation gets into it, a bunch of other, and the next thing we're in phase 3, I forgot to update this, we're now in phase 3 clinical trials of an ALS drug that is looking really, really exciting. Okay, and the way we enable this is to look at the natural process, in my opinion, of molecular collaboration, hence the name of the company, Collaborative Medicinal Development. The next one is alignment. Okay, again, for 300 years of chemistry, we humans have heat things up to high temperature, put things under high pressure using harsh reagents. Biology, what do? Everything is at room temperature, at ambient pressure, using water as a solvent. I'm not the first one to see this. This is obvious. People say this all the time. But what I did the next step, I said, why? Why does nature get to do it this way and we humans can't? And one day it hit me. A thermometer is a molecular speedometer. If you ever want to lie in bed wide awake at 2 o'clock in the morning and drive yourself crazy, ask yourself this question. Is molecular velocity a consequence of temperature, or is temperature a consequence of molecular velocity? We have to go back to the Big Bang, chicken and eggs and stuff like that. But anyways, the point is that there's this thing called the Boltzmann distribution, and as we increase the energy, the average velocity of the particles within a system increase proportionally to the energy, and it's a distribution of things. And so when we learn chemistry, the first year chemistry, we learn about shapes of orbitals. We learn about s orbitals and p orbitals. And why in the world do we need to know this? Well, the reason that this is so cool is because the molecular geometry and the electron density, the regions in which the electron density occupy it, dictate molecular reactivity. When you put these two molecules together, all they do is bang into each other over and over and over again. 99.999% of the time, they just bump into each other. Every once in a while, maybe 0.1%, maybe 0.01% of the time, comes at exactly 180 degrees and we get the chemical reaction. The reason we humans put things under high temperature, high pressure, and harsh reagents is not to make the reaction happen, but to make collisions happen, the good collisions and the not so good collisions. It's not a very pragmatic way of doing things, okay? Now, here's the point. There is never a reactive collision in biology. Never do two molecules crash into each other and react. In biology, the cellular matrix is a semi-viscous state in which the molecules have inhibited diffusion. And what happens is they snuggle up to each other first. And after they snuggle up to each other, then they react. And interestingly enough, the same regions of electron density that dictate chemical reactivity dictate that snuggling up. A hydrogen bond is a snapshot in time of a protonation reaction. A pi stack is a snapshot in time of like a Diels-Alder reaction or another paracyclic reaction. So if we can learn from nature and find ways in our manufacturing process and in our product design to find ways to orient things just the right way, we can become super efficient at doing that, lower energy and much more sustainable. So my example again is another company that I spun out with my investor called Ambient Photonics. This one here, I'm just a bit of a crazy person, but this is a famous Escher drawing, okay? It's you see at the top birds and you see fish on the bottom, but when do the birds stop being birds and when do the fish stop being fish? It's kind of a confusing picture there. Well, I find that in nature, most transitions in nature, most boundaries are not discrete straight line things, but have a bit of fuzziness like that. So I said to myself, okay, how does electron transfer happen in a mitochondrial matrix? It's not a big jump. It's a bunch of little molecules that assemble next to each other to make each little jump a little bit smaller. So I said, can I make a semiconductor look something like a chromophore and have the chromophore self-assemble with the electrolyte? Oh my goodness. So what I did was I made a solar cell. This solar cell, Michael Gretzel, the godfather of photovoltaics, sent in the thing. He measured it. It is the most efficient dye-sensitized solar cell in history because I looked at how nature does this orientation and was able to do it. It's not for outdoor use. It's for indoor ambient photonics. If I turn off all the lights in my room, put one candle in the corner, and I have this on the back of my cell phone, I'll never have to plug it in. Just not a lot, but a little bit of electrons will constantly be charging. And so cell phones, electronic devices, sensors, e-readers, so we started the company, we're in pilot manufacturing. We already have purchase orders from companies to put this in the next generation of products. It's looking at how nature orients and taking advantage of that concept. The next example is synchronicity. Okay, I dream of one day the Star Trek replicator. You know, Captain Picard comes in tea, Earl Grey, hot. Well, what I really mean is, can you imagine having a box where I take my cell phone, my pair of glasses, and my cup, and I push a button and I pull out a laptop computer or something. Imagine being able to disassemble and assemble things like that. It's not as crazy as you might think, okay? Nature does it all the time. We do large molecules, small molecules, catabolism, and anabolism, and we can couple it with energy. But let's look at it this way. When we learn chemistry, I think we learn chemistry a little bit wrong. We learn chemistry. Here's this molecule, reacts to this molecule, reacts to make that molecule and that molecule. We almost think of it as a performance on the stage. Here the actors come on, they react together, they go off the stage and the products come. Life is not that simple, all right? Here's a thought experiment. Imagine that you're sitting and you're watching Romeo and Juliet. But because I'm a bizarre person, I'm going to put King Lear on the stage at the same time. And then I'm going to put Richard III, then I'm going to put Hamlet, and then I'm going to put Macbeth. Your head is exploding. 5 plays on stage at the same time. The actors are just doing their thing, pretending that the other actors aren't there. You're looking at Hamlet, you're looking at Lady Macbeth, you're looking at Romeo, you're looking at Juliet. Okay, now think of the cacophony of input that you're trying to do with 5 plays. Now, think of what happens in a cell. Not 5, not 50, not 500. Thousands of chemical reactions are happening at the same time on the same stage, and somehow they happen at the same time indifferent of each other, at least in synchronicity with each other. How does nature do that? All right, here's my daughter, a very old picture of my daughter. She's playing with these toys. If we take these toys, you've all seen me before, it's kind of boring. If a new piece comes, now you can start doing different things. It's good for product design. You introduce a new building block and you can do really cool things. Let's look closer at these toys though. They're really cool. They've been designed for disassembly. My daughter plays with them all day. When she goes to bed, my wife and I take them all apart, put them back in the bag, right? So they come apart too. They're reversible, but not completely. There's aspects of them that aren't. But my metaphor for chemistry falls short, of course, because we use our hands to assemble this thing. And obviously, molecules we can't see, we can't touch with our hands. So the metaphor, to be accurate, would be we take these pieces, we put them in a magic box, and we shake the box, and we shake the box, and go, please, 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 and somehow magically the thing that we want comes out. Of course, that's not going to happen. We're going to get this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and all kinds of other crazy intermediates and other things like that. There's no way we're going to get what we want. But that's what happens in cells. There's no hands in cells making things happen. What's going on? Here is my example. Imagine, okay, we have these pieces that snap together. What if I put some Velcro on some of the pieces? The Velcro sticks together, but it doesn't care about the snap. The Velcro is synchronous with the snap, but doesn't compete. If I put a button in, a button's not going to compete with the Velcro, isn't going to compete with the snap. So here I have these mechanisms of connectivity that are synchronous with each other, but not competitive. Now, all of a sudden, if I design this thing, I put the pieces in the box and I shook it, there's actually a pretty good chance I'm going to get what I want because there's a unique kind of combination that these things can be. So you're now saying, John, he must be high. This is crazy. This is ridiculous. Wait, look at my daughter's cheek. What do you want to do to that cheek? You want to pinch that cheek. Growing up Sicilian in the Boston area with a million aunts and uncles, every family gathering, I was completely convinced I was going to be hospitalized because one of my relatives was going to pinch my cheek and rip it off, okay? So I'm really kind of traumatized by this. But looking at that, I think about why does it work? It works because elastin, the protein elastin, deforms but snaps back. Well, let's use our lens of chemistry. What are the amino acids in this elastin? The carbon-carbon nitrogen atoms, well, gee whiz, they're kind of like that Lego block, aren't they? And when the amino acids make these peptides, the peptides form the amide bonds. It's kind of like my snaps. All right. And if we think about the hydrogen bonding up here, well, that's kind of like the Velcro. And the desmosine units that make these cross-linking systems, well, that's kind of like my button. Nature does this. If we can learn from nature and learn what chemical reactions to combine, how to sequence them, and how to design these systems, we're starting to talk about being able to do this. So my vision and dream is that not tomorrow, not next year, but in 20, 30 years, can we have in every house a 3D printer? And you make 300 Yoda heads, because that's all people do with 3D printers, is you make Yoda heads and baby Yoda heads. And then after you're done with your Yoda heads and your baby Yoda heads, you put them in a box, push a button, and it makes the spool of input, and you put it back into the 3D printer. We can start thinking of different materials to disassemble and assemble. It's not impossible. And this is what, so another one of the companies that I spun out, one day I was thinking about the chemistry of insect sclerotization. Sugamaran, Professor Snanikan Sugamaran in biology, one of my dear friends, always used to do this work in which you watch the molting of insects, that when the insect sheds its exoskeleton, it's white, and then slowly it turns pink and brown and ultimately gets black. One day, long after I left Umass, I was saying to myself, there's something in nature that goes white to black. I think there's something special here. People color their hair, all right? Maybe if I look at this thing and I look at the terracinase oxidative cascade that happens in sclerotization, and what I did was I found velvet bean. I didn't grind up dead bugs. There's a bean that has this exact same oxidative cascade of tyrosine. I got that extract. I got a bunch of gray hair, and it worked. Not only did it work, it didn't wash out, it didn't fade out, and more importantly, me being the greatest person in the building, I hit myself with my head. My hair goes back to color it was 30 years ago. A woman with black hair that's gone gray, it goes black. Someone with brown hair, it goes brown. This doesn't color your hair, it restores the human pigment. Think about that. It's non-toxic, actually edible, environmentally benign, doesn't wash out, doesn't fade out. You don't pick the color, it restores the color to your hand. In the same way that we have a fingerprint, your hair has a hairprint. And for the last 4 years now, you can go on the market, www.myhairprint.com, and you can buy this stuff. It's $39.99. If you act now, they'll probably sell it, put in a set of knives or something. But the point here is that using this mechanism of nature allowed me to invent a technology using the principles of green chemistry, actually do something in the real world and have a product on the market. My last example is diversity. Now, diversity is a really important subject. Human diversity. I would make the candid statement that if the chemical enterprises embraced diversity 50 years ago and was more open-armed to different ideas, different eyes, different hearts and minds and thoughts, we wouldn't be here today talking about sustainability, because someone would have said, "You're using that? Why would you do that?" But because we resisted this diversity and inclusiveness, we're stuck with all these silly mistakes because we had this myopic view. Hopefully we're getting better. We got a long way to go. But what I'm talking about here is not human diversity. I'm talking about molecular diversity. All right, if I do a chemical synthesis, to be fully complete, I should say, we bring some petroleum out of the ground. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, or Freeport, Texas, we put one functional group, a chlorine, a hydroxy group, or something. And then we open up the textbook of organic chemistry, put on carboxylic acids, nitro groups, sulfate groups, amides. We make these very complicated, beautiful molecules. But wait, I kind of left something else. Where does the petroleum come from? Well, actually, the petroleum 100 million years ago was actually plant matter. So truth be told, take a molecule that has hydroxy groups, carbonyls, acids, amides, nitro groups, buried in the ground for 100 million years, remove all that functionality, turn it into a boring hydrocarbon, pump it out of the ground, and put them all back. Well, why not bypass 100 million years? This is not a new thought. Thomas Edison in 1906 dreamed of doing stuff like this, but we still haven't made headway. Why is it so hard? The reason it's so hard is because making a bio-based material is not that difficult. We can make cells do things. I work for the company Zymogen. I believe that this is the future of the world, this combination of chemistry and biology and blurring the lines. But it's really easy to make the molecule, but it's hard to make it at scale at high purity. That's the rub. And so companies, if they're going to replace a material, well, they want it to be 99.999% pure. Well, that's going to be really hard. Designing systems based on purity is a trap. If I could invent the time machine and go back in time, I'd say to the engineers of the 50s and 60s, don't do that. Because now you've locked the system into a narrow processing condition, and any replacement material has to meet these standards. But you don't have to do that. Nature never uses pure materials. Nature doesn't tolerate diversity, it embraces diversity. Think about this Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer here. The cell membranes around its heart is fluid and the gases are passing to at around 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Down in 32 degrees in the snow, the fluidity and the passivity of the gases is the same. We humans couldn't design that system, but the way nature has it, it's a distribution of molecular weights, of isomers, and what happens is in the cold, one group of isomers kicks in and does something. In the heat, a different group kicks in, and having all those components and diversity present, it adapts, and the resilience of nature is based on its adaptation because nothing is pure. Everything is a mixture of materials. Now, if we could do that, if we could take a bio-based process that gives 85% this, 5% this, 2% this, as long as it's reproducible, and we invented our systems to embrace that distribution of materials, now we're cost effective. Now we can compete with the petroleum industry. We can actually start doing this stuff. So my example of this is on June 29th, 2015, I found myself on the center stage of the United Nations General Assembly. There's my big head being projected up there. 14 days earlier, I got a phone call from the show Whale Wars on cable TV. They had just confiscated in La Rochelle, France, 75 tons of some ocean trash. And they called me up and they said, John, we need to separate the nylon from the polypropylene. We need you to pull out the heavy metals and the pigments. We want it extruded the special way. In my lab, I didn't have the right extruder. So I went online and I found a plan. I built the extruder and worked and worked and worked. And next thing you know, I made a bunch of spools of this thread, sent it to Germany. Guy on the board of directors of Adidas standing beside me on the center stage of the United Nations, holding up the 2017 running shoe made out of ocean plastics, invented that in my lab in 14 days. And the reason we were able to do that is because I didn't make it 100% pure. I didn't reconstruct virgin plastics. I said to myself, as I grind this up, as I mix this, nature has a certain predisposition for how these materials will mix. And instead of spending a great deal of time and energy separating, and I said, well, maybe that's a better material. And it was. And so it allowed me to, by respecting that inherent diversity, I could very quickly invent. And now Adidas has made insane amounts of money. There are three different lines of clothing now that are branded as Parlay Ocean Plastic shoes. This does work. Using the principles of green chemistry and using nature as a teacher, it makes us faster, more efficient, and morally and ethically in a really good spot. So I hope that this discussion was useful for you and that I gave you a different way of looking at things. Please remember my disclaimer. I don't claim to be some guru with gifted insight. It's just person that sees the world in a certain way, and with a great deal of vulnerability and humility, I'm happy to have shared that with you. I hope that it was interesting to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting and sparked so many thoughts. It must be quite challenging at this point, looking back over the time that you've been working on these things. And you commented that universities are slow in adapting this mindset, and I could understand that. How do you deal with that type of challenge to I don't know if it is a paradigm shift in
you know, the thing is Yvonne, the Beyond Benign Foundation, the nonprofit organization, has what we call the green chemistry commitment. Okay, and the green chemistry commitment asks the chair of a chemistry department and the chancellor or the provost or somebody to sign a document saying that somehow that department is going to find a way to get this into the required curriculum of every student, not an elective, not a subtrack, but make this a fundamental self-definitional part of what that department does. And I don't go and ask anybody to sign it. All right, there are now about 95 signers globally. UC Berkeley, UC Davis, University of Toronto, universities in Spain and Colombia and Argentina and Brazil and Australia. We've had about almost 100 signers of the commitment now, and every day more and more universities are signing it. So I'm just really, you know, the community of green chemistry is just so awesome. There are so many faculty who just really fundamentally get it and are changing the world, and we're just trying to keep up. And the idea is we share best practices. If one university wants to have a standalone class called green chemistry, that's fine. If one university wants to have a seminar series, if one university wants to integrate it into the labs, we're not prescribing anything. We're just saying, how can you model it so that every student gets exposed to this? Because it's like a virus, and it's kind of a bad metaphor these days. But once a chemist, especially a younger chemist, gets this and understands this, they're infected, and they will refuse to see the world in any different way anymore. And so, frankly, the way I look at it, there are some universities that'll get it. And there's some universities that won't, but I'm not looking for every university to sign the commitment. Hey, everyone's got a right. If they don't want to do it, don't do it. But the point is that someday it'll just be status quo. And it'll probably take retirements and deaths of some faculty, but that's just the way it is, and that's the way it's been with everything. And I'm okay with that. I am not going to stand on a soapbox and preach it. What happens when people come to me and say, John, you've got 300 patents. You've spun out 5 companies. You've worked with over 100 multi. How does one person do all that? And I say, because I do green chemistry. That's it.
Do you see high schools?
Yes, so very important. So Beyond Benign has a parallel K through 12 program in which we have over 300 lesson plans. And what our model is we don't, again, come and preach and say, you should teach green chemistry. We recognize that STEM education has a lot of issues, and that what we've done is we've got these 300 lesson plans that don't teach green chemistry, but say, when you're teaching this, use this lesson plan. And so a 3rd grade teacher in Montana has no choice what they're going to teach the 2nd week of February. The state has kind of defined the curriculum. So we have cross-referenced all the state standards, and for free, not even a penny, not in PDF, in Word, so the teacher is encouraged to make it their own. They download these lesson plans, and say you're learning about, say, geometry. You could say, okay, class, draw a triangle, draw another triangle. What's the difference in their sides? Or you could give them a map of the Amazon rainforest and say, here is a map of part of the forest in 2020, and here is a map of that forest in 1918. Draw a triangle around it. What is the difference in the size of that triangle? Now, when you're talking that this is measuring deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, that student is saying, man, there's a reason to know this. They're actively engaged. The teachers are actively engaged. The community is actively engaged. And guess what? Subconsciously, we're teaching them about sustainability. And so that's the model. And so statistics show that if a child at 12 years old has not had a positive experience in the sciences, they'll never be interested in it. So we need to get it into the curriculum. And oh my God, what do? Most people in chemistry, what they do, they come to a class and they say, hey kids, watch me light this on fire. Watch me blow this up. And the kids are going, okay, my Game Boy is a heck of a lot more interesting than that little fuzzy thing. That might have worked in the 60s, but the world has kind of evolved. And actually, people that think it's really cool to blow things up, not really sure those are the ones we want in chemistry anyways. But if you come to the class with a soft voice and say the world has problems, we have all kinds of issues facing us, you could go into chemistry, you could invent a technology, and hundreds of thousands of people you will never meet might not be exposed to a carcinogen, might not be exposed to something that causes birth defects. Imagine if you're the one that invents that. That's a lot more powerful than that little puff of brown smoke.
I had some very specific questions come in about your thoughts on what kind of role chemical recycling should play in waste management from this perspective, things like gasification and pyrolysis.
Okay, I'm gonna come from that from a very different perspective than what you may be expecting. What's happening in our polarized society is that we're being asked to pick a camp. One camp is all about recycling, the circular economy. Let's use polyethylene, and as long as we can recycle it or pyrolyze it or do something like that, that's good. And then there's another camp saying, no, we need biodegradation and composting and things like that. And in our polarized world, it's like we're being asked to pick one or the other. I don't see it that way. I see it as being a merger of both. Why can't so in my opinion, we want a biodegradable, triggered biodegradation material, but we don't want to single use it. We still want to recycle the material as much as possible. But the idea is human behavior is impossible to control. And so we can say this will be perfect as long as it doesn't get into the environment. It's going to get into the environment. But the idea is not to design it to someone just throw into the environment. We design it to be recycled and kept into use and reuse as much as possible. But if it does get into the environment, instead of ending up in a turtle's eye in the ocean, maybe it can degrade. So if we invent the technologies to be both recycling and compatible to an ecosystem, it's a lot higher order, but that's where we need to be. It's not one or the other, it's both.
I know green chemistry is not remedial, and it's not cleanup technology, but any thoughts on
it is, well,
how to
so
deal with microplastics?
yeah, so yes, the point though is, sadly, many remediation technologies actually use hazardous materials and create a different problem while cleaning up the other. So green chemistry has an important role to invent technologies that the ends don't justify the means here, and that it's actually a green chemistry technology that is doing the remediation. So in that perspective, where we need to invent ways to deal with microplastics in the ocean, we better do that using green chemistry, because if we're using toxic materials to clean up the microplastics in the ocean, we've just moved the problem to a different space. So yes, remediation technically isn't green chemistry, but we need green chemistry to invent the technologies. And so they are intimately related.
This is such an interesting topic. I could keep asking questions and discussing, but I should probably end this seminar, and perhaps at a later time we could have a follow-up down the road with you, but this was such a treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Proud to be part of UMass Boston.
So am I. Well, on that note, thanks everyone who joined us, and we will have another one of these at some point.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.